Hi, I'm Venora. My father once said something that changed my life forever. She's dying soon. Stop wasting money on her. Then he threw my grandmother, the woman who raised me, into a thunderstorm like she was nothing, just minutes after she signed over her $1.6 million home. My mother? She just turned away. I took Grandma in, but by then, she was already broken, and when the will was finally read, what she left behind silenced everyone. Want to know why? Before we dive in, tell me, who would you trust when even your own family sees you as disposable? Stick around. The rain wasn't just falling. It hammered down, like the sky itself wanted to punish someone. I stood frozen on my porch, fingers tight around the railing, watching the woman who raised me, my grandmother, shiver on the steps of my father's house. She was holding two things, a small battered suitcase and her chipped white teacup. That teacup. She'd had it longer than I'd been alive, and still, he left her standing there. Hours earlier, inside that house, I'd heard my father's voice cut through the air like a knife. She's dying soon. Stop wasting money on her. I remember the way those words sat heavy in the air, how I opened my mouth to speak, to argue, to plead, and how the door slammed in my face before a single word could escape. Now, from the shadows of my own porch, I watched as Grandma stood still, drenched, her frail shoulders shaking from more than just the cold. I should have gone to her sooner, but there was something paralyzing about seeing the woman who once carried me on her hip, now treated like trash by her own son. When I finally moved, it was like pushing through mud. I rushed down the steps and crossed the narrow yard. "Grandma?" My voice cracked in the rain. Her eyes met mine, confused, lost, but not surprised. "They said I'm a burden now, Venora." I had no answer, only shame. I took her suitcase with one hand, wrapped my arm around her small frame with the other, and led her to my apartment across the street. My father's porch light flickered behind me as I walked away. Inside my apartment, I peeled her soaked coat from her shoulders. The skin underneath was pale, cold to the touch. I wrapped her in my best blanket, not that it mattered. Nothing felt like enough. "Sit here, Grandma." My voice sounded wrong, shaky. I set her down on the couch and ran to put water on for tea. Not that tea fixes betrayal, but it's what you do, isn't it? When you don't know what else to do. As the kettle hissed, I turned to look at her. She was holding that chipped teacup in both hands, like it was the last piece of her life she could still claim. I wanted to ask her why she gave him the house, the deed, everything. But she spoke first. "He's my son, Venora. I don't understand." Neither did I. But in that moment, what hit harder than her confusion was my silence. I poured the tea, added just a little sugar, how she always liked it, and placed the warm cup in her hands. She sipped slowly, her hands trembling less than before, but her eyes remained distant. I sat across from her, unable to stop watching. Somewhere in the hum of rain and the faint tick of the clock, my mind wandered back. To being 10 years old, to my father's voice echoing down the hallway. "Don't talk back." To my mother's silence every time I looked to her for help, and to me, sitting there, learning how to stay quiet. Because silence in our family wasn't just survival, it was expected. But tonight, staring at Grandma shaking under my blanket, her lips pale around that chipped porcelain rim, I wondered something I'd never dared before. Is silence the same as cruelty? I didn't have the answer. I pulled my knees up to my chest, hugging them, watching the woman who once sewed my Halloween costumes, now reduced to someone tossed into a storm. "She's dying soon." That wasn't just a sentence. It was a sentence. I don't remember falling asleep. Only the steady sound of rain and the distant crack of thunder as Grandma drifted into exhausted sleep on my couch. I stayed awake, and somewhere around 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, I whispered words I didn't even know I believed until they left my mouth. I don't think I can forgive them this time. The kettle's whistle had faded into silence hours ago, but sleep never came. I sat at the small table, staring into the shadows as Grandma dozed on my couch, her hands curled around that chipped teacup even in sleep. The apartment was silent, except for the rain still pattering outside, and yet all I could hear was his voice. "She's dying soon. Stop wasting money on her." That sentence had roots in me now. I could feel it, like splinters under the skin. I closed my eyes. And just like that, I was back in their house. Earlier that day, before the storm, before the shouting, before the door slammed, there we were, standing around the dining table like strangers. The lights were too bright, the air too thick. My father sat at the head of the table, papers neatly spread out. He looked at Grandma not like his mother, but like a problem he needed to finalize. "It just makes sense," he said, in that careful, condescending tone of his. "We're simplifying things, avoiding legal hassles later." I watched Ada hesitate. Her hand hovered over the paper, the pen trembling between her fingers. "It's your house," she whispered. Why now?" "Because," he said flatly, "you're 82, Mom. You've had a good life." The silence after that was louder than the rain outside now. She signed. I still remember the sound of it. The scratch of her pen as she wrote her name, then lowered the pen like it had drained the last of her strength. I looked at my mother across the table, silently begging her to intervene. But Maeve just sat there. She nodded once, tight and small. Not in agreement, but in compliance. My father gathered the papers, stacked them precisely, like closing a deal at work. "That's done." I stood up then. "Dad, don't." His glare stopped me cold. "You've taken everything she owns," I said, my voice shaking, "and you're still not done, are you?" His jaw tightened. "This isn't your business, Venora. She's my mother." I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. And he knew it. What came next was worse. He turned to Ada, not as a son, but as a man talking to someone irrelevant. "You're old. You're dying soon. Stop wasting our money." The words weren't shouted. That would have been better. He said them casually, almost like explaining a grocery bill. I remember the way Ada blinked, once, twice, like she hadn't understood at first. Then her shoulders folded in on themselves. She looked smaller. And my mother? She stood up, walked toward the hallway. I waited for her to say something, anything. She didn't. She turned her back. I stood there, useless, watching as my father guided Ada toward the door like she was luggage he needed out of the house. His words echoed in my head, even now. "Goodbye, Mom." I should have done something. I should have screamed, fought, anything. But I froze. I watched him open the door. I watched the rain start soaking her the second she stepped outside. I watched. Back in the apartment, I reached for the blanket I'd thrown over her hours earlier, tucking it around her shoulders even though she was still asleep. Her breathing was light, shallow. She didn't let go of the teacup. I got up slowly and moved toward the bathroom. I didn't turn on the overhead light. Just the small one above the mirror. My reflection looked wrong. 33 years old, working as a paralegal, handling other people's conflicts for a living, and yet when it came to my own family, I'd said nothing. I braced my hands against the sink. I've been silent all my life. It wasn't just today. It wasn't just tonight. I thought about all the years hearing my father's lectures, my mother's sighs, the decisions made without me, around me, despite me, and I thought I was keeping the peace. I thought silence meant I was choosing grace. But tonight I'd watched my grandmother, the woman who held my hand through every childhood fear, get thrown into a storm like she was a piece of old furniture, and I hadn't stopped it. Tears burned, but I refused to let them fall. My silence didn't keep peace, it enabled cruelty. I gripped the edge of the sink until my knuckles ached. Maybe I am the coward. Morning came gray and heavy. I hadn't really slept, though I must have drifted off at some point because the kettle was cold when I touched it, and Ada was still on the couch, her small frame curled around that chipped teacup like it was the last thing holding her together. I moved slowly, quietly. My body felt stiff, like I'd been holding tension all night long. Maybe I had. In the kitchen, I made toast. Plain, dry, just enough to put something in her stomach. Coffee brewed black, sharp, the way she liked it. I didn't ask if she was hungry. I just set the plate and mug on the little table next to the couch. Ada stirred, blinking slowly, her hair sticking out in wisps. When her eyes found mine, they were too clear, too awake for someone just roused from sleep. "Why did he do it?" she asked softly. I opened my mouth, closed it again. She sat up, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the teacup still resting in her lap, raising it carefully to sip the air like habit. I poured fresh coffee into it without a word. She took a small sip, the chipped rim pressing against her lips. Why did he do it? I couldn't answer. Because he could. Because no one told him no. Because I never told him no. My throat felt tight. I sat across from her but couldn't meet her eyes. The silence between us stretched thin, brittle as glass. Her voice broke it. "Your father wasn't always like this." I swallowed hard. "Did you ever tell him no?" Ada's gaze shifted down to the cup. She didn't answer. Neither did I. The minutes dragged, filled only with the soft clink of porcelain when she set the teacup down. Then my phone buzzed. I reached for it automatically, heart sinking before I even looked at the screen. "Owen. Stop interfering. This is family business. You'll understand when you have your own children." I stared at the message. My hands felt cold. Another message flashed through almost immediately after. "Maeve, Dad's just stressed. Don't make things harder." I sat motionless, reading those words over and over. 2 sentences from my mother, crafted perfectly to dismiss my anger while sounding concerned. As if I was the one overreacting. As if their betrayal wasn't something real, but a phase I'd grow out of. I didn't reply. I didn't think. I just hit delete. For both. I watched their words vanish from the screen like they'd never existed. Part of me expected relief. Instead, my chest felt heavier. Ada must have seen my face because she whispered, "What did he say?" I shook my head. "Nothing that matters." She didn't push. That hurt more than if she had. I cleared the plates, needing something, anything, to do. Washing dishes felt safer than thinking, but my mind betrayed me. Because while I scrubbed, memory hit me like cold water. I was 12 again, sitting on the stairs after knocking over a glass vase in the living room. My mother's voice came from the kitchen. "Just keep quiet, Venora. It's easier." I'd believed her. I'd believed silence was safer. Every time something went wrong, every time Dad's anger filled the house, every time Mom went quiet instead of standing up, I'd mirrored her, silent, obedient, invisible. I rinsed the soap from the plate and realized my hands were shaking. I went back to the couch sitting beside Ada. She had drifted again, the teacup resting in her lap. I stared at the lines of her face, the exhaustion etched into every wrinkle. This ended with me. I didn't know what that meant yet, but I knew I couldn't be quiet anymore. I looked at her, watching her chest rise and fall, listening to the fragile sound of her breathing. And I whispered the first real truth I'd admitted to myself in years. The words hung in the air long after I whispered them. I'm not my mother. But in the quiet of my apartment, doubt crept in like a slow fog. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the blank screen of my phone. The weight of silence filled the room, heavy, choking. At some point, I found myself dialing. I didn't even remember walking to the kitchen or sitting down at the table. My fingers just moved almost on their own. Owen's name glared back at me from the screen. I hesitated. Then I hit call. It rang once, twice. And then his voice, sharp, impatient. What? I forced my voice steady. Why did you do it? A pause. I could almost hear him smirking through the line. What are you talking about now? You know what I'm talking about. Silence stretched. Then came the laugh, cold, short. This isn't your concern, Venora. My breath hitched. She's your mother. And you? His voice turned mocking. What have you ever contributed? To this family? To anything that matters? I swallowed hard. Don't call me again about this. You'll understand when you grow up. Or when you finally have kids of your own. And just like that, the call ended. I stared at the screen, hearing the hollow beep in my ear. For a long time, I just sat there. Not crying, not thinking, just empty. When the knock at the door came later that evening, I almost ignored it. But something made me get up, walk down the short hall, and open it. Maeve stood there. Not a text this time, not a voicemail. She came in person. She looked around my apartment with that same expression she always wore when she visited, like she'd stepped into a motel that smelled faintly of bleach and regret. I didn't know you still lived here, she said softly, stepping inside without waiting for me to invite her. I said nothing. She spotted Ada's sleeping form on the couch and immediately lowered her voice. I came to check on her. Did you? She ignored that. She always did. I know you're upset, Maeve said carefully, but Dad's under a lot of pressure. You know how he gets. I folded my arms. Don't make things harder for him. I waited. Let her say whatever it was she came to say. I just don't want you wasting your life over this, Venora. She paused, brushing invisible dust from her jacket sleeve. You've always had potential. Don't throw it away trying to be a hero. I kept silent. She tilted her head, her voice softening in that way she used when she wanted me to feel like a stubborn child. Maybe it's time to think about other options. Professional options. A nursing home could take better care of her than you can in this apartment. I said nothing. Her eyes flicked toward Ada's small form, wrapped in blankets. Don't sacrifice your life for someone whose time is up. I felt my throat close, but I still didn't speak. I watched Maeve shift, uncomfortable in the silence she hadn't expected. Finally, she let out a soft sigh. I'll tell Dad you're just emotional. She left, and I let her. The door clicked shut behind her. I sank onto the floor, knees pulled to my chest, and let the tears fall. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was being foolish. Maybe this tiny apartment, this chipped teacup, this frail woman asleep in my living room, wasn't worth throwing everything away. My phone was back in my hand before I realized it. I hovered over Owen's name. My finger trembled above the call button. I could apologize. I could say I'd overreacted. I could pretend none of this happened. Ada would be sent somewhere safe, and I could go back to whatever life I thought I had. I closed my eyes. Then, a voice, barely audible. Don't let them decide. I turned, heart lurching. Ada's eyes were open. Her voice was fragile, but her gaze was clear. Don't let them decide. And suddenly, everything I felt cracked open. I wasn't just angry at them. I was angry at myself, for thinking even for a second that they were right, for believing that silence was safer, for almost handing my strength back to the very people who'd taught me to bury it. I looked down at my phone. I didn't press call. Instead, I set it down, next to the chipped teacup. I whispered the words to the woman who'd fought harder than anyone deserved to, and now lay broken in my home. I won't. I whispered it like a promise, but by morning, the weight of reality pressed harder than ever. The first envelope arrived as I was pouring black coffee, the scent bitter and thin in the air. I tore it open without thinking, expecting another grocery coupon or a late bill. Instead, it was medical. Ada's emergency care from the night I'd brought her in shivering from the rain. $3,000. Due in 2 weeks. A second envelope followed before noon. Labs, prescriptions, follow-ups. I didn't need to calculate. I already knew my savings, what little I'd scraped together from overtime hours at the firm, wouldn't stretch. Not with rent, not with groceries, not with her. I sat down at the small table in my kitchen and laid out every bill, every dollar left in my account. The numbers didn't lie. But neither did the silence from the couch where Ada slept, curled like something fragile the world had forgotten. I whispered to no one, I'm not strong enough. I stayed there until the coffee went cold. That night, when Ada finally drifted into uneasy sleep beside me, I let myself cry. Silent. Small. Like if I kept the tears quiet enough, they wouldn't count. At some point, the tears stopped, but the ache stayed. I lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling when the memory surfaced. I must have been 5, maybe 6. It was winter. I'd lost my coat somehow, left it at school, I think. I remembered my parents arguing about it, voices sharp behind closed doors. I remembered feeling cold, shivering by the window. And then Ada, quiet as always, kneeling beside me with a red scarf. Keep warm, always. She wrapped it around my neck with careful hands, tucking the ends close to my heart. No lecture, no anger, just warmth. No one else had ever done that. I remembered that scarf. I lost it years later, but the feeling stayed. And tonight, I felt the cold all over again. The next morning brought another blow. A letter, this time certified. I signed for it with hands I barely recognized as my own. Inside was the official deed transfer. Ada's house. The house I'd played in as a child. The creaking staircase, the smell of pine in the backyard, was now Owen's. Officially, legally, irrevocably. I sat down on the floor, deed in hand, and felt something inside me fracture. They hadn't waited for her to die. They'd taken it while she was still breathing. I found myself drafting a message on my phone, thumbs moving before thought could catch up. You stole what was never yours. I stared at the words. Deleted them, typed again. You took her future while she watched. Deleted. I set the phone down, sat there in silence, holding the phone like it might burn me. Ada stirred in her sleep, murmuring something I couldn't catch. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't about a house. It was about erasure. They weren't just stealing property. They were erasing her, one signature at a time. And I'd let them. I stood up. I didn't remember putting on my coat. I just remembered walking. It was raining again. Not a storm, just steady, relentless drizzle. Enough to soak skin through. I stood outside Owen's house for a long time. The gate was locked. The porch lights were on. I could see their shadows moving behind the curtains. I didn't knock. I didn't yell. I didn't even cry. I just stood there, watching, breathing. And when the cold finally sank deep enough, when the rain traced lines down my cheeks like tears I refused to let fall, I whispered to the house that once held every Christmas, every birthday, every piece of my childhood, "This ends." The words echoed in my head as I walked home from Owen's house, soaked through, shoes heavy with water. I didn't remember leaving the gate or how long I stood there in the rain. I only remembered the weight in my chest, not anger anymore. Something colder, something clearer. When I reached my apartment, everything felt too still, the kind of silence that isn't peace but warning. I opened the door and knew. Ada wasn't on the couch. I found her in the bedroom, crumpled beside the bed, her breathing ragged, her skin pale, sweat beading her hairline. A note sat folded on the nightstand. I didn't need to read it to know who it was from, but I did. Enough suffering. Maeve's handwriting. Calm, deliberate. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I moved on instinct, calling 911, my hands moving without thought, my mind somewhere else entirely as I told the dispatcher our address, her age, her condition. The words felt like someone else's voice. The ambulance came fast, lights flashing, but every second felt endless. At the hospital, I watched strangers work to save Ada while I stood useless in the corridor. Somewhere inside me, something cracked. Not like glass shattering, not sharp. Slower. Deeper. When the nurses finally told me she'd stabilized, that she was resting, I nodded like I'd heard them. I'm not sure I did. I sat in the waiting room drenched, hair plastered to my face, water pooling under my chair. No one looked at me. No one spoke. And there, sitting in that cold, bright place, something inside me changed. I wasn't sad. I wasn't scared. I was angry. Not the kind that burns. The kind that freezes. I left the hospital without thinking. I drove through the rain, streets blurry through the windshield, tires sliding at every stoplight. By the time I reached Owen's house again, the sky had started to fade from black to gray, but the rain didn't stop. I stood at the gate, pressed the buzzer, waited. He opened the door himself. No hesitation. "Have you finally come to your senses?" His voice was casual, like we were discussing the weather. I remembered suddenly being 5 years old, standing in this same doorway, holding a broken doll, hearing that same tone when he told me to stop crying over junk. Not this time. "No," I said. My voice was calm. Too calm. "I'm here to remind you. You'll answer for every minute she suffered." He laughed. Actually, laughed. Then he slammed the door. I stood there a few moments longer, listening to the echo of the lock clicking into place. The rain pressed against me, heavy as lead, but I wasn't moving, not yet. Later that morning, I sat in a small office at Legal Aid. I told them everything. Not the whole story, not yet. Just enough. Elder financial abuse, property theft, endangerment. The woman helping me didn't ask many questions. She just nodded, took notes, asked for copies of the deed transfer, hospital bills, and my grandmother's state. By noon, the papers were filed. An emergency injunction, the first blow. Owen received the notice that afternoon. I didn't see it happen. I didn't have to. Maeve called my phone 3 times within the hour. I didn't answer. I imagined the conversation as clearly as if I stood in the room. Maeve panicked. "What did you do, Owen? What did you drag me into?" Owen, cold. "She's bluffing. She doesn't have proof." I knew him well enough. That's why I wasn't bluffing. I sat in my car outside their house. Again. But this time I didn't knock. I pulled out my phone and typed 2 words. "Check your email," and I sent it. Inside that email was a single file. A voice recording. Ada's voice, fragile but steady, recorded in the hospital that morning. She said I was a burden, my son. He said my house was his. He said I wasn't family anymore. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I watched the house. I waited. And this time I imagined Owen's silence. Not anger, not disbelief, worry. I sat there in the rain, headlights dimmed, windshield wipers pushing away steady streams of water, each drop trailing down the glass like cracks forming. I watched those lines and whispered to no one but myself. "This isn't a bluff." I said it to the rain, to the night, to myself. But the next morning, it became real. By the time I woke, my phone had already exploded with notifications. Maeve's social media posts were everywhere. She didn't waste time. A picture of me from years ago, smiling, young, captioned with, "She's isolating our mother. We're worried. She refuses visits. Pray for Ada." And beneath it, hundreds of comments from strangers who didn't know me, didn't know us, didn't know anything. "She looks cold. Why would a granddaughter do that to her own grandma? She just wants the money." I didn't respond. I didn't scroll. I just sat on the edge of my bed, phone resting on my knees, and listened to the silence pressing in around me. Minutes later, a text arrived from Owen himself. "Any fool can throw stones, but I build walls." I stared at that message longer than I should have. They thought they'd won. I let them think that. Court was scheduled for noon. By the time I walked into the courthouse, it felt like every eye knew me from Maeve's posts. But none of that mattered. Not now. Owen and Maeve stood near the entrance. Maeve's eyes flickered when she saw me. Owen didn't even glance my way. He was too busy shaking hands with their lawyer. I didn't look at them. I kept walking. Inside the courtroom, everything felt too big, too loud. Papers shuffling, voices murmuring, my own heartbeat in my ears. I sat down next to my attorney, a woman named Clara. She didn't smile. She didn't speak unless necessary. That's why I trusted her. The hearing started. Owen's lawyer stood first, calm, confident. She claimed my grandmother had been manipulated in her final months. that Ada's mental state had been questionable, and that there were concerns about isolation and undue influence. They had even prepared a forged medical note from some out-of-state psychiatrist, a man Ada had never even met. Then Maeve's accusations were read aloud, word for word, from her social media posts. They painted me as a predator, a thief. I listened. All of it. Then Clara stood. She didn't argue. She didn't fight back. Not yet. Instead, she handed a sealed envelope to the judge. "This," she said simply, "was notarized 8 months ago. Discovered within the belongings of Ada Kinsley, hidden inside a personal item given to my client during childhood." The judge frowned but opened the envelope. A folded piece of paper. I knew every crease. Ada's will, her real will, hidden inside the red scarf she'd given me when I was 9. I remembered wrapping it around my neck that winter, never knowing what she'd hidden inside its lining. Clara stepped aside, and I stood. I unfolded the paper with trembling fingers, and read, "I know who will stand by me when I no longer stand for myself." Ada's words, her handwriting, her truth. The room fell silent. Owen didn't move. Maeve's face drained, her knuckles white against the wooden bench. I kept reading. "I leave what I own, not to those who claim blood, but to the one who stayed." The judge cleared his throat, visibly shaken. Owen's lawyer tried to protest, but no one listened. The judge ruled within minutes. Owen's access to Ada's estate was frozen effective immediately. I was granted emergency authority pending full investigation. When the gavel fell, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like something heavier. I walked past Owen on my way out. He didn't speak, neither did Maeve, and neither did I. In the parking lot, I sat behind the wheel of my car, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. I reached over, unfolded the red scarf slowly, like it might vanish if I moved too fast. Ada's handwriting caught the sunlight filtering through the windshield. I traced the words once more. I breathed, and said softly, "Not to the scarf, not to Ada, not even to myself. I'm not done." That thought followed me like a pulse as I sat in silence, phone in hand, staring at the invitation I'd typed out. Simple, direct. "Meet me, 1 hour, if you want this buried." No threat, no explanation, just a line he'd understand. I pressed send. I wasn't sure if he'd show, but deep down, I knew he would. Owen Kinsley didn't like loose ends. He arrived 47 minutes later, pulling up to my apartment building like he was still the one in control. He walked in without knocking, without a word. The rain from earlier had dried, but his coat dripped anyway, like the weather clung to him. I didn't greet him. I led him to the living room. No coffee, no small talk. The small speaker was already set in the center of the table. I watched his eyes flicker toward it. "Sit," I said quietly. He did. The silence hung for a moment, thick as the air before a storm. Then I pressed play. Ada's voice filled the apartment. "Why, Owen? Why are you taking the house?" I heard the quiver in her tone, even though I'd played that clip a dozen times by now. She'd sounded scared, small. Then Owen's voice answered, "Because you're dying, Mother, and your worth is in that house. That's it." A pause. Then Ada again. "You said you'd care for me." Another cold reply. "I said what you needed to hear." I watched him listen to his own cruelty. His hands, once steady, clenched the edges of the table. His eyes, usually sharp, stared at nothing. Maeve had recorded that, months ago, probably to protect herself. She'd deleted the file, thinking it was gone. But panic makes people careless, and discarded phones don't wipe themselves. I'd retrieved it. Now it was mine, and his. I let the last few seconds of Ada's shaking breaths echo out. Then I clicked stop. "Is that a bluff too?" I asked him softly. Owen didn't speak. For the first time in my life, he didn't have words, and I realized then he wasn't powerful. He was hollow. "I used to wonder what scared you," I said, standing. "Turns out it was your own voice." He stood too, abruptly, knocking the chair back, but he didn't argue. He left, without a single word. By the time I uploaded Ada's recorded statement, along with that audio file, to the Attorney General's Elder Protection Task Force, my hands didn't shake anymore. The media caught it within 24 hours. $1.6 million fraud. Granddaughter fights back. They printed that headline beside Owen's picture. Maeve's name wasn't far behind. She cracked first. I watched the video clip online like everyone else. Her standing outside the courthouse steps, reporters crowding around her. Her voice sharp, brittle. I told him not to do it. He forced me into all of this. I didn't know he'd hurt her. I shut the clip off. Let them destroy each other. That night, I drove alone. No more hearings, no more lawyers, no more emails, just me and Ada. Her grave was quiet when I arrived. The headstone was plain, simple. She wouldn't have wanted anything grand. I stood there for a long while, breathing in the cool night air, listening to the silence that no longer pressed against my skin like a punishment. Then I took the red scarf from my coat pocket, folded neatly. I placed it at the base of her headstone. "You're free now," I whispered. "And so am I." I didn't cry. I smiled. My phone buzzed in my jacket as I turned to leave. Attorney General's office, case opened. I let out a slow breath and whispered one last time. "This ends here." I meant it. I didn't need the headlines anymore to confirm what I already knew. The Attorney General's office had filed formal charges against Owen and Maeve, elder exploitation, fraud, conspiracy, their accounts frozen, their names in every local paper. But none of it gave me the satisfaction I'd expected. Maeve filed for separation within a week of the indictment. I heard about it from a neighbor of theirs, not Maeve herself. She's blaming him for all of it, says he dragged her down. Maybe he did. Maybe she let him. Owen, once the man who controlled every word spoken in our family, now walked the grocery aisles alone. People looked away when he passed, even the ones who used to call him Sir. The silence he once used to control people now surrounded him like a cage. I didn't care. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need revenge. I just needed peace. And so, I went home. Not to my small apartment. To Ada's house. It was officially mine now, after the judge's final ruling. But standing on the porch that first morning, keys in hand, I realized how little that meant. Ownership wasn't victory. It wasn't justice. It was just a set of walls that had once held a woman I loved. I stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old cedar. Memories lingered in every corner, in every creak of the floorboards. I didn't speak. I just started moving. I opened the windows. I stripped the dust covers from the furniture. I let sunlight find its way back into the rooms. And in the garden Ada once tended, I dug barehanded into dry soil. I replanted her lilies, the ones she'd loved but had watched wither after she left. It wasn't much, but it was something. I didn't tell anyone. No announcements, no social media posts, no triumphant victory speech. I simply lived. Weeks passed. One morning, while drinking coffee on Ada's porch, I looked at the house with different eyes. It didn't feel like a house anymore. Not just. It felt like history, and I realized history needed to mean more than betrayal. So I called the local community center. It wasn't hard to explain. I wanted to donate the house. I told them, not for profit, for purpose. That became its new name, Ada's House, a shelter for elders abandoned or forgotten, just like Ada had been. The opening ceremony was small, modest, just the way she'd want. I stood in the back, letting the volunteers take the spotlight. They deserved it. Someone, probably a volunteer, maybe a neighbor, hung a red scarf above the entryway that morning. They didn't know. They couldn't have. But I saw it. And for a moment, I couldn't move. The scarf swayed lightly in the morning breeze, a simple piece of cloth, but to me, it was a symbol, not of pain, of survival. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. I just breathed in slowly and let the moment pass. People smiled at me as they passed. Some said thank you. Others simply nodded. I nodded back. Later that evening, as I walked home alone, I thought about the word family. For years, it had meant a prison, obligation, fear, silence. But standing on that porch, I'd seen something different. Sometimes family isn't who raises you. It's who stands beside you when standing costs everything. I never forgave Owen. I never forgave Maeve. But I stopped carrying them with me.